Experience the true beauty of justice served. Our cinematic narratives speak directly to the soul and challenge the way you look at the world of right and wrong. Join our community today by hitting that subscribe button now.
The prenup had a clause he forgot he signed. My attorney's smile told me everything before she even spoke. I found out on a Tuesday. Not because my husband sat me down and told me the truth, he never had the decency for that. I found out because a dry cleaning receipt fell out of his jacket pocket while I was doing laundry, and the name on the order wasn't mine. It was for a woman's blouse, size 4. I haven't been a size 4 since I was 19 years old. I stood there in our laundry room, the receipt in one hand and his dress shirt in the other, and I did something that surprised even me. I folded the shirt neatly, placed it on top of the dryer, set the receipt beside it, and went to start dinner. That was the moment I understood something about myself. 27 years of marriage had not made me weak. It had made me patient. My husband's name is Alan. We met when I was 24 and he was 29, at a firm where I was a paralegal and he was a junior architect with ambitions the size of the buildings he sketched. I believed in those ambitions before he did. When his firm nearly collapsed in 2009, I was the one who kept our finances together on a teacher's salary while he rebuilt. When he made partner 6 years later, we celebrated with a bottle of champagne we could finally afford. I told him that night that everything we had built together. He nodded and kissed me and said, "I know, Diane." I believed him. Looking back now, I can trace the unraveling with the precision of someone who spent too many years ignoring the signs. The late evenings that stretched into late nights. The business trips that left no receipts I could find. The way he started holding his phone face down on every surface. Small things. The kind of things a woman in a good marriage tells herself mean nothing. I was not a woman in a good marriage. I just didn't know it yet. Her name was Kelsey. She was 31 years old, an interior designer his firm had hired to consult on a luxury residential project. I learned all of this later, in pieces, the way you learn things you never wanted to know. The dry cleaning receipt was in March. By April, I had confirmed enough. I didn't confront him. I called my friend Patricia instead. Patricia, who had been a family law attorney for 22 years, and who had sat beside me in the hospital 3 years earlier when I was finishing my last round of chemotherapy. She was the kind of friend who showed up without being asked and stayed without being told to leave. "Come to my office," she said, when I told her what I had found. I sat across from her desk the following afternoon and watched her pull out a document I hadn't thought about in over 2 decades. Our prenuptial agreement. Alan had insisted on it before we married. His parents' bitter divorce had left scars he never fully healed from, and I had understood that, had signed without resentment. The agreement had been straightforward. Assets brought into the marriage stayed separate. Joint assets would be divided equitably. But there was one clause Patricia pointed to now, tapping the page with one finger. An infidelity clause. If either party engaged in a documented extramarital affair during the marriage, that party would forfeit their claim to any appreciation in jointly held assets accumulated after the 5th year of marriage. Alan had forgotten it existed. I know he had, because when I later thought back over the years, I could not recall a single conversation where he had ever mentioned it. It had been buried in legal language 27 years ago and left there, unread and unconsidered, while he made his plans. Patricia looked at me across the desk. "How well documented are you?" I opened my bag and placed a folder on her desk. She looked through it slowly. Then she looked up. "Diane," she said, "let me handle this." I told her to wait. Not yet. I needed to understand the full picture first. What I did not tell Patricia, what I had not told anyone, was that I already knew something else. 6 weeks earlier, completely by accident, I had overheard Alan on the phone in his home office. The door was partially open. I was coming down the hall to tell him dinner was ready. I heard him say, "The Callaway Ridge project is going to change everything. Once that deal closes, we're talking about real money, Kelsey. The kind of money that changes what's possible." I had stood in the hallway and listened to my husband describe our future to another woman. Then I went back to the kitchen and served dinner and said nothing. The Callaway Ridge project was the largest contract Alan's firm had ever landed. 18 months of work. A luxury residential development on 40 acres outside the city. It was set to close in June. When it did, Alan's share of the firm's profit distribution would be substantial, the kind of number that made everything Patricia had shown me in that prenup clause suddenly, sharply significant. I went back to Patricia the following week. "Now," I said. She nodded slowly. "Tell me what you want." What I wanted was not what people might have expected. I did not want a scene. I did not want to humiliate him publicly or appear in court with photographs and testimonies. What I wanted was simple: the truth on record, the agreement enforced, and to walk away from 27 years with what I had actually earned. I also wanted our house. We had bought it together in 2003. A Victorian on a tree-lined street that I had spent a decade restoring, room by room, during school vacations and summers, while Alan traveled for work. I had stripped the floors myself. I had chosen every fixture, every paint color, every piece of hardware. That house was mine in every way that mattered, and I was not leaving it. Alan told me he wanted a divorce on a Thursday evening in May. He came home early, which itself was unusual enough to make me set down what I was reading. He sat across from me in the living room I had designed, in the house I had restored, and he said he needed space. That the marriage had run its course. That he hoped we could be adults about it. He did not mention Kelsey. I looked at him for a long moment. The window behind him framed the oak tree we had planted in the backyard the year we moved in. It was enormous now. "All right," I said. He blinked. He had prepared for something else. An argument, tears, questions. The look on his face when I said nothing more was something I filed quietly away. "I'll have my attorney contact yours," I said. "I assume you have one?" He did. What Alan did not know was that Patricia had spent the previous 3 weeks building a file that was, in her words, airtight. Documentation of the affair, time-stamped and sourced. A forensic accounting summary of the appreciation in our joint assets since year 5 of the marriage. A valuation of the house. He also did not know that I had spoken with his business partner, Marcus, who happened to be an old friend of my brother's and who had not appreciated learning what Alan had been doing on those out-of-town trips. Marcus had not volunteered information. He had simply confirmed, when I asked him directly, that what I suspected was accurate. He said he was sorry. I believed him. The mediation meeting was scheduled for a morning in early June, 4 days before the Callaway Ridge closing. I arrived first. I sat on one side of the conference table with Patricia beside me and a cup of coffee I didn't touch growing cold in front of me. Alan arrived 8 minutes late with his attorney, a man I didn't know, who wore a very good suit and the slightly distracted expression of someone who had not yet reviewed the other side's documentation. Alan glanced at me as he sat down. He looked tired. I noticed he had gotten a haircut recently. I wondered if Kelsey had suggested it. The meeting opened with the standard framework asset inventory, division proposal, timeline. Alan's attorney presented their position, which was reasonable and orderly and based entirely on the assumption that our prenuptial agreement was a simple document with a simple division formula. Patricia waited until he finished. Then she placed a copy of the prenuptial agreement in the center of the table, opened to the page she had shown me weeks ago, and said, "I'd like to draw your attention to Section 7, Paragraph C." The room was quiet for a moment. Alan's attorney leaned forward and read. Then, he sat back. Then he looked at Alan. Alan's face had changed in a way I hadn't seen before. The careful, composed expression he'd maintained since sitting down had gone somewhere else. Replaced by something uncertain, something searching, as though he was running through calculations he hadn't prepared for. "Alan," his attorney said quietly, in a tone that suggested this was a private conversation they had not been able to have, "did you disclose?" "I know what it says," Alan said. His voice was flat. What the clause meant, in practical terms, was this. The Callaway Ridge distribution, which was days away from closing and represented the single largest appreciation in our joint assets in the history of our marriage, would not be subject to simple equitable division. Under the terms he had signed and forgotten, the claim to that appreciation was forfeit. It also meant the house. Patricia set the documentation on the table. The affair. The timeline. Every piece of it. Organized and dated. Alan looked at me then. It was the first time he had looked directly at me since sitting down. I did not look away from him. I also did not speak. There is something I have thought about often since that morning, what it feels like to sit across from 27 years and see them clearly for what they were. Not entirely wasted. Not worthless, but built on something unsteady, on a foundation that had been quietly cracking for longer than I had admitted to myself. I had given that marriage everything I had, including 3 years of fighting a cancer diagnosis that had aged me in ways Alan had not found interesting. I had come out the other side of chemotherapy and radiation and 2 surgeries, and I had come home to a husband who had decided, somewhere in the middle of all of it, that he needed someone younger, and lighter, and unburdened by any of that. I had earned every gray streak in my hair. I was not ashamed of a single one. The negotiation continued for another 2 hours. I will not pretend it was simple. Alan's attorney was skilled, and there were genuine legal questions about the clause's enforceability that required careful argument. Patricia had anticipated every one of them. She had prepared for this meeting the way I imagine surgeons prepare for difficult operations, with complete knowledge of where the complications would arise and exactly how to address each one. By noon, we had a framework. I kept the house. I received my share of the Callaway Ridge distribution. Alan received considerably less than he had expected to walk away with. He did not look at me as he left. I sat in the conference room for a few minutes after everyone else had gone. Patricia came back in and sat beside me and didn't say anything for a moment. "How are you doing?" she finally asked. I thought about it honestly. "I'm all right," I said. And I meant it. What happened next, I heard secondhand, through Marcus, who told my brother, who called me on a Sunday afternoon with a tone of voice that told me it was not bad news before he said a word. Kelsey had apparently had very specific ideas about what a relationship with Alan looked like. A successful architect. A large income. A certain kind of life that she had been told was coming. When the Callaway Ridge numbers she had been anticipating were replaced by numbers that were considerably more modest, her interest in building that life recalibrated quickly. She was gone within a month. Alan called me once, in late July. I let it go to voicemail. He said he wasn't calling to cause trouble. He said he just wanted me to know he was sorry. He said he knew that didn't change anything. He was right. It didn't change anything. But I listened to it twice, alone in my kitchen, in the house I had restored board by board and room by room. Outside the window, the oak tree in the backyard caught the late afternoon light the way it always did in summer. I had planted that tree. I had watched it grow for 22 years. It was not going anywhere. I deleted the voicemail. Then I opened the back door and went out into the garden. My mother had kept a garden her whole life, right up until she couldn't. When she passed, 7 years ago, she left me her tools, old, wooden-handled things, worn smooth in all the right places from decades of use. Alan had always considered them clutter. He had suggested more than once that I donate them or at least move them out of the main shed. I had always said no. They were in the shed now, exactly where they had always been. I picked up her favorite trowel and turned it over in my hands. The wood was warm from the afternoon heat. I started digging. There is something about working with your hands in the ground that organizes your thoughts in a way almost nothing else does. I have always found it to be true, and it was true that afternoon. I thought about the years I had spent being careful, being accommodating, making myself smaller so that the life we had built together could feel larger than it was. I thought about the woman who had sat across from Alan in that conference room and said nothing because nothing was, in that moment, exactly the right thing to say. I thought about my students I had taught 7th grade English for 23 years and the ones who came back sometimes to tell me things. The quiet girl who had become an attorney, the boy who had written terrible first drafts and eventually published novels. I thought about how I had always told them that a story without difficulty was not a story worth telling. That the parts that hurt were the parts that meant something. Patricia came for dinner 3 weeks later. We sat on the back porch with a bottle of wine I had been saving for no particular reason, and she looked out at the garden and said it looked beautiful. "It's getting there," I said. She asked me what I was going to do next. I had been thinking about that. I had tenure. I had the house. I had the portion of the Callaway distribution that was rightfully mine, sitting in an account I had opened in my name only. I was 49 years old, and I was, for the first time in a very long time, making decisions that belonged entirely to me. "I'm going to take a sabbatical," I said. "There's a writing program in Vermont I applied to years ago and never went." Patricia smiled. "You should go. I have been told, occasionally, by people who knew us as a couple, that they are sorry for what happened. I understand the impulse behind that. But I am not sorry in the way they expect me to be. I am sorry for the years I spent quieting something inside myself that deserved to be heard. I am sorry that it took a receipt falling out of a jacket pocket for me to stop pretending I did not know what I knew. I am not sorry for any of the rest of it. The acceptance letter from the Vermont program came on a Thursday in September. I read it at the kitchen table with my coffee, in the morning light that came through the east window exactly the way I had always planned when I chose the windows. The house was quiet and entirely mine. The letter said the program started in January. I wrote back the same afternoon and said yes. The oak tree had turned gold by then. It did that every year, that particular shade of amber that lasted only about 2 weeks before the leaves began to fall. I had always loved those 2 weeks. Alan had never noticed them, not once in 22 years. I noticed them now, the way you notice things when you are no longer sharing your attention with someone who does not deserve it. Some things take time to become what they were always meant to be. I suppose I was one of them.